So a while back when I still had a LinkedIn account, it was brought to my attention that the Psychological Association commented and made sure that everybody understood that they believed that the Derek Chauvin jurors, jurors in the Derek Chauvin trial, made the right decision. Okay. And people might be going, oh, well, that's just being politically correct, etc. They have to do that. No, they don't. Because the Psychological Association pretends to be a scientific organization. And I'm not going to make an argument about how psychology, hands down, is a completely bullshit science that has more to do with the casting of I Ching Yarrow sticks, or tarot reading, or astrology, or numerology, or anything of that nature than it does an actual science, but that really is the truth. Psychology is complete and utter horseshit compared to something like biology. If psychology were actually a science, it would be called neurology, or something like behavioral neurology or something like that, or something of that nature. But it's not, and the reason it's not is because it is not a science. And as I have stated in previous videos, this doesn't mean that I believe that psychology is not helpful, or that some of the methods and modalities of therapy are not helpful, but I believe that psychology is helpful like philosophy is helpful. Essentially, that's what psychology is philosophy. Some of it has more basis in reality than other aspects of it. But more importantly, what you have to understand, and this is not, and you will see in the description because I leave links to other things, about how the Psychological Association ostracizes white people. You will notice very anti-white articles that are right from the Psychological Association. People might remember I made a number of videos about that. Arun Kilanani, the psychiatrist, the Pakistani psychiatrist that said that she fantasized about murdering her white clients. Now, of course, psychiatry and psychology are different, but people might be asking, well, how can somebody like that have a medical license? How can somebody like that practice mental health? And I think this is a common question amongst people that do not work in mental health. If you remember, I worked in mental health, and I was a recipient of mental health care also. And frankly, I think what the biggest problem is if you are a white American, you are not safe receiving mental health services in the United States of America. That's just the truth, because you have the Psychological Association with their blatantly anti-white, anti-heterosexual, anti-Christian language. And then you have organizations like the Psychiatric Association that allow people like Arun Kilanani to become a medical doctor and well, that's the AMA, but you have the AMA and the Psychiatric Association that allow this crazy person to practice psychiatry while she actively fantasizes about murdering her white patients. And remind you, she had her job after that lecture that she gave. And that lecture was a lecture that you had to take as a medical student to become a psychiatrist. So it wasn't like that lecture was just like, oh, this is something you have to attend, blah, blah. No, that was a credentialing lecture that all psychiatry students at that school had to take. And that's what you have to understand. Now, as a former recipient of mental health care, I've stated this in the past. I don't like bringing up that I was in mental health institutions, but as a juvenile and an adolescent, you see the way that the African American psych techs, a psych tech is, they're the people that restrain the crazy people. If the crazy people go crazy, the psych techs restrain them. Now, as a juvenile, when I was my first hospitalization was at age 10, And from there, I was basically repeatedly Well, I had a patch of not being hospitalized uh, until I was 13. After my father had died, my mother had used the hospital as well. Actually, what it was is my case manager used the hospital as a way to keep me safe in his mind from my brother and my mother's drug behaviors. And they were filling the house with like gang members and all sorts of. So in his view, that was how that worked. And then, long story short, my mother and my brother started utilizing it as a way to have me deemed mentally incompetent to try and keep me from getting the portion of the house that my grandparents had bought for my brother and I, essentially. It didn't work, although I did get fleeced in the long run because I'm a helpful person, and I gave basically all my money to my mom and my brother because they needed help, I thought. And they did need help, and they still need help. But it's like when a drunk wins the lottery, uh, their money woes are not answered by winning the lottery, and that's unfortunately I found that out the hard way, and went through about $59,000 helping these two idiots, and they both despise me after I helped them out. Of course, I should have realized that after they spent so long trying to have me deemed mentally incompetent. But the long and the short of it, as they say in England, is that when I was in inpatient facilities that were basically managed by African Americans for the most part, that's who controlled the floor, you would see these psych techs, mostly young African American men, some were older African American men. They would simply just haul off and punch a white person, a white child, if they didn't like it. There was one instance where a young lady, well, not even a young lady, she wasn't a young lady yet, I suppose. She was about, I think she was about 15 at the time, if I'm remembering correctly. She was raped by her mother's African American boyfriend. And the gentleman that was accosting her was one of the people that worked there, and made her get on her knees in the middle of what's called the group or the community room, and state that she enjoyed it in front of all of us. I mean, and this is normal behavior, because who's going to regulate this behavior? They run the floor. You get what I'm saying? There was also a number of, now I don't know this for a fact, but there was a number of accusations of rape and sexual abuse by many of these children against the employees of the hospitals that I was at, particularly the one hospital. When I was a juvenile, when I was 10 years old, like I said, I've always been a mean son of a bitch, even when I was 10 years old. There was a gentleman, I forget what the reason was, but this is when I was 10, so I wasn't as large as I am now. He decided to try and squeeze the life out of me, started strangling me. I believe the thing was I got in an argument with another person on what's called on the floor. So he became, when they got me alone, him and another individual whose job it was, who was watching, he put me on the ground and started trying to squeeze the life out of me, like squeezing my neck with his hands. And I took his two fingers and I peeled them back until I damn near, if I didn't break his fingers, I'd be surprised. I did. I started punching him after that. This is prior to my karate and all that. Like I said, I didn't take karate because I needed to learn how to fight. But the thing is, I was quite a bit smaller than the gentleman. And it wasn't until maybe 4 days later, my father and my grandmother had come up. My grandmother was very concerned about me while I was in my first hospitalization, because it was right after my grandfather had passed away, and I didn't handle my grandfather's death well. And so my grandmother and my father came up, and I had bruises all over my neck, all over my chest, all over my face. I was bruised up really bad. And my grandmother had asked, what the hell happened here? Because my grandmother grew up in an orphanage. I'm sure she witnessed her fair share of child abuse in the orphanage. And also, her father was very abusive, not to her, but toward my uncle, her brother. So she was not a big fan of child abuse. And she was quite upset, of course, and my father wanted to get to the bottom of it. Nothing ever did come of it legally because they protect their own. Another time when I was an adolescent, not a 10-year-old. At this point, I was probably 13, almost 14, maybe. And an African American gentleman decided he would try again. He tried to punch me, and I just put my hand up, more like a boxer type block, not a karate type block, but like a boxer type block. And then he came in and started choking me. So I did break his hand, I know that. And luckily, the charge nurse, because the place was about ready to press charges on me for injuring him, and luckily the charge nurse had a stroke of conscience. The charge nurse is the nurse that's in charge of, that's who's really in charge of the floor, but they usually don't intervene with what's going on. And luckily, she had a stroke of conscience and said something. But at the time, 13, 14 years old, I made a formal complaint. But they run it off as, well, this person's crazy, this person's crazy, this person's crazy. And I suppose what I would say is the moral of the story here is, if you are Caucasian, or if you have family members that are Caucasian, or heterosexual for that matter, and they're receiving mental health services, and I don't care what their diagnosis is. I don't care if they're schizophrenic. I don't care if they're schizoaffective. I don't care if they're mentally retarded. I don't care. And that's another thing. I'm working in mental health. I've seen a lot of abuse of the mentally retarded by African Americans also. But what you need to keep in mind is, I don't care what the condition of the individual stating that they're being abused is, or being bullied, or being told things, being belittled, being made to believe that being white is a sickness. I don't care what their state of mind is, or what you believe their state of mind is. If you're their family member or their caregiver, or in any way in charge of that person's well-being, you really need to take what they're saying seriously. And I think that it's far, far, far past the time when we really need to speak up as a country and state that racism in medicine and in mental health cannot be tolerated, period. There cannot be racism in the mental health field. There cannot be racism in the medical field. But I think what's interesting is, this is exactly what they're claiming to be fighting, but they're only fighting it one way. The way that there isn't really any racism coming at you from the mental health community. You have to keep in mind, the majority, and this has been this way my whole life, there's not many, if any, conservatives in the mental health field. Very few, very, very, very few. I've yet to meet, even the ones that are conservatively leaning are still liberal. They're either socially liberal, or they're just liberal, but they might believe in Jeebus, or they might have their questions about homosexuality or something like that. But generally speaking, everyone in mental health, everyone that I've ever met that's worked in mental health, is a liberal, is anti-white. Okay, they might not be anti-white to the point of militancy, but they're anti-white to the point where they believe that whiteness is a sickness, that whiteness creates an ego, a sense of self that is poisonous to society. Now, on the bright side, what I will say is a lot of the student interns, although I highly doubt they're still working in mental health because I highly doubt they've tolerated it long enough to continue working in mental health. A lot of the student interns that I worked with that were college kids were fed up with this crap. They had enough of it, at least the white ones. They had enough of the bullshit, and they were embracing traditionalism, conservatism, anti-homosexuality, and they were embracing their whiteness, their culture, things like that. Mostly women, not the men. The white men are still very pathetic. A lot of the white women were embracing their whiteness, embracing their pride and their heritage. They were turning away from the liberalism, turning away from the homosexual agenda and things of that nature. But that's not many of them. It was, I shouldn't say it's all of them. It was some of the student interns, few of the student interns, but enough of them that it did seem as though that there were enough of them that they know that there are people, if they're still in mental health, that know what's going on, know who's calling the shots, and know who the shots are being called against. And that's very important to understand. But this is not a new thing, it's just become less obscure. It's more in the open now because they feel as though they can move, and move they are. Okay. So another thing that you have to worry about, like I said, if you were a Caucasian American, if you're a white American, you have a lot to worry about by receiving mental health services in this country. You have a lot of, like, I received false diagnoses, to which my outpatient psychiatrist was absolutely he was absolutely astonished by, because I had none of the symptoms of the so-called psychiatric disorders I was diagnosed with. The one that he thought was the stupidest was xenophobia, which is classified as a fear of foreigners. And the reason I was classified as xenophobic was I was 302'd a number of times by a Liberian a Liberian doctor that could not speak English, which is interesting because I believe Liberia's language is actually English, but that's besides the point. What happened was his lack of English skills was not the reason that I was 302'd. What had happened is he came to see me the next morning after I was, my mother had called the police on me, and the police gave me a choice, go to the hospital or be arrested, etc., yada, 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 cooked up nonsense. So I said, okay, I'll go to the hospital. So I go to the hospital, and people don't know what a 72-hour notice is probably, but so I go to the hospital, I wake up the next morning, and I meet my doctor, and my doctor is this Liberian gentleman, and he could not speak English. I had nothing against him, being an African American, or I guess an African that is an American, or an African whatever. That was not my issue. My issue was the dude couldn't speak English. I had to ask him to repeat everything about 5 or 6 times and still couldn't understand it. And what happened was, essentially, I said, no, I want a different doctor. They refused to give me a different doctor. So I signed a 72-hour notice. Within, I don't know, a few hours of signing my 72-hour notice, I was in the mess hall, and a Jewish gentleman, interestingly enough, pulled a butter knife on me. Now, this was a stainless steel butter knife. It was not, flat, like plastic flatware or anything like that. It was a stainless steel butter knife, and serrated at that. So you could do damage with what it was. So he pulled the butter knife on me. I don't even remember the reason why. I think he was just having a bad day that day. And I took the butter knife from him. Well, I didn't even take the butter knife from him.
I kicked him in the groin and punched him in the face twice, and then he came at me with the knife, like tried to stab me in like the side of the head with it, and that's the point at which I took the knife from him. And then I put my hands and I'm like, dude, just chill, just chill. I remember exactly what I said. Then he tried to punch me. I slipped the punch. I punched him and not tapped him in the cheek, like tapped him a little bit, punched him in the cheek, and he kept coming at me. So I punched him a couple more times. And what was interesting is even the psych techs, the black psych techs that held me down, once I realized I was being held down and that he was being held down, I no longer was attacking the gentleman. And they actually wrote statements, well, because they have to. Whenever there's an incident, you have to write what happened. That is exactly what happened. I was 302'd, 303'd, 304'd, etc. And it actually does go up like that. A bunch of times. I was in there for about a year and 9 months. And what was very interesting is my public defender successfully proved, by bringing in an outside psychiatrist, that I didn't suffer from any acute or chronic mental health disorders. But because the gentleman, that the doctor that appeared every time, he said I was racist, xenophobic, and violent, despite the fact that I had not been in another incidence of violence the whole time I was there, because nobody else had attacked me. So essentially, what was so interesting is they would not let me out based on this diagnosis of xenophobia and acute violence. The doctor actually stated, I'll never forget, he goes, because like I said, I go, look, my public defender says I'm not mentally ill. The psychiatrist that we brought in says I'm not mentally ill. I'm not mentally ill. There's no reason to keep me here. And I'll never forget that the doctor said, violent beget violent, is how he said it. Violent beget violent. And that was the grounds for keeping me there against my will. And people don't understand, when you're a mental health patient, you have far less rights than a criminal, because it's up to your doctor whether or not you can have counsel with a lawyer or whoever else. Yes, you have the ability to have counsel with a lawyer, but first you have to be cleared to be considered safe to see that lawyer, or safe to see whoever you're seeing. And you do not have the right to speak to family members. At one point, when I was an adolescent, when my mother and my brother were trying to have me deemed mentally incompetent, and I didn't have access to the trust, my grandmother's will and trust. Once I got that, that's when I moved on, forcing the sale of the house and all. That's another story. But my friend's father, now, I hadn't talked to this gentleman. This is years later, maybe 3 years after my father died. I'm amazed I remembered the phone number. But a friend of mine's father, I called him up from the hospital instead of my mother, because it was, like, you're only allowed to call your family, or you're only allowed to call whoever the doctor okays you to call. Anyone else, you're not allowed to call. So I called him, told him where I was, told him the address, etc. No, it was more than 3 years later, because I was just turning 18. That was, okay, that's what it was. So you're talking 3.5, 4 years later. So my friend's dad, thank God my friend's dad actually did this. He came and he explained, you have no legal right to keep this guy. They released me to his recognizance, meaning not my own recognizance, his. I was not allowed out without somebody watching me, was the whole dealio. So they released me to his recognizance, thank God, and that put an end to that long stay in the hospital system. But the thing is, what you have to remember is, with the aggressive anti-white attitudes in the mental health community, it's very dangerous, because you could find yourself in many bad situations and there's no way out. It could become a living hell for you because you have, it was bad enough with the Jewish doctors that wouldn't like you if you were, if you had certain political views. And to be honest, a lot of the Jewish doctors aren't really that bad. They're more or less. Some of them are. Some of them catch an attitude, but more or less, once they realize you're not a slavering barbarian maniac that wants to kill and rape their children, they're generally okay. They generally understand where you're coming from. Usually, I had a Dr. Cohen. He grasped where I was coming from. The same cannot be said for my Cuban psychiatrist or my Liberian psychiatrist. Uh, Strangely enough, my Korean psychiatrist was pretty good. That was in one of those places. But my point is you might find yourself in hell, and the only way out is the people that you're allowed to talk to. And if you're not allowed to talk to certain people, you have no access to the outside world, if you get what I'm saying. So, and if those people don't want to help you, you're trapped. There was one institution I had escaped from when I was 13, and unfortunately, my mother had called the police on me and they put me back. The situation with the ridiculous anti-white sentiment in mental health in the United States is atrocious, and it is time that people speak up and firmly state no racism, none should be tolerated against anyone. People should have the ability to seek mental health and physical health services without the fear of being ostracized or even killed. Remember, Arun Kilanani fantasized about murdering her white patients for being white. And that was during a credentialing lecture that she confessed to that, or I should say proudly stated that. And that's what I want people to understand is if your family member is receiving mental health services and they say something isn't right, something isn't right. Okay, that's the bottom line there. Something is not right. If your child or your brother or your sister or your father or your grandfather or your grandmother, and this goes with convalescent homes too, age homes, homes for the elderly. There's a lot of that going on in the homes for the elderly too, and you really need to be made aware of the situation. And I'm going to leave a link to a guy that killed, I think it was 60 patients of these elder care homes in Texas, I believe it was. And I'll leave a link to that. It's just absolutely disgusting what's going on in this country anymore. And there's nobody speaking out against it. You can't trust the system at this point because the mental health system and the medical system is against white people. And we can't tolerate racism in this country, regardless of who it's against. No racism against white people, no racism against, what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that you can't tolerate racism. What I'm saying is, we can't tolerate racism from our medical and mental health professionals because it has turned the system into an untrustworthy, dangerous system where we can't trust what medical professionals and mental health professionals are saying anymore. We can't trust that there's not a racist angle behind it or that they're not attempting to harm somebody based on their race, religion, creed, etc. When I was a Satanist, when I was a Levian Satanist, there was a lot of hatred against me by born-again Christians in these facilities that were psych techs, and they would bring their Jesus crap in there, and I'd say, no, I refuse to attend this crap. And a lot of these people were, like, for example, they forced me to attend when I was 13. They found marijuana in my system, and I was forced to attend Narcotics Anonymous. And Narcotics Anonymous was being done by a Catholic church. And it wasn't done properly. It was not the secular Narcotics Anonymous that people might be familiar with. No, it was not. We did all this Catholic baloney. And I had stated time and time again, it's my legal right, and it is in the Patient's Bill of Rights, because there is a Patient's Bill of Rights, and I'll put that in the description too. You have a right to abstain from religious nonsense. And at the time, I was a devout, well, not devout, but I was a Levian Satanist. And I had stated, this is against my religion. I have religious freedom. I have the freedom not to participate in this. And I was forced to participate in Catholic Mass against my will that was being done by a Catholic priest pretending to be running a Narcotics Anonymous group. So you have a violation of people's religious freedoms. You have a violation of people's ability to be who they are, who they are born as, to be white Americans, to be, and like I said, their religious freedoms. If I was an Episcopalian, I would not be permitted to receive Catholic Mass. What's even more bizarre is, according to Catholicism, non-Catholics are not permitted to receive Catholic Mass. So it was confusing on many levels, but I mean, that's all for this video. Do please follow the links in the description. Please follow them, read them, understand them. Understand the reality of the situation, because the reality of the mental health system in this country is very, very bad, particularly towards the treatment of white people. And that's all.